The lawyer's perfect revenge. You need to help me, David. I'm the only person who can save you now. Victoria Richardson stood in the doorway of the law firm as if the last 10 years had simply ceased to exist. Her pristine white Bentley was parked conspicuously outside, its luxury contrasting starkly with the modest neighborhood where David had painstakingly rebuilt his life after she abandoned him. David Thompson, now 35 years old, remained seated behind his simple wooden desk, studying the woman who had once completely destroyed his world. She looked exactly as he remembered, blonde, elegant, wearing that impossibly expensive perfume that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But there was something fundamentally different in her eyes now. Panic. Sit down, Victoria, David said calmly, without even glancing up from the legal documents spread before him. 10 years, and you still believe the entire world revolves around you. Victoria settled uncomfortably into the worn chair, clearly disturbed by the simplicity of her surroundings. Everything about this modest office seemed to offend her sensibilities. David, please, she began, her voice urgent. I need you to forget the past. My husband Richard was arrested yesterday for tax fraud. The federal authorities are investigating all our business operations. I could lose absolutely everything. The irony was almost poetic. David remembered that day with perfect clarity 10 years ago, when Victoria had announced she was leaving him to marry Richard Richardson, the privileged heir to Richardson Industries. You have no future, David, she had said coldly. You'll never be more than a neighborhood lawyer struggling to survive. Richard can give me the life I actually deserve. At the time, David had been just starting out as a newly graduated attorney, desperately struggling to pay the bills for the small basement office he'd rented. Victoria had met Richard at an exclusive high society party where she worked as a public relations coordinator. Within mere weeks, she had decided that her 2-year marriage to David was nothing more than a youthful mistake she needed to correct. And why exactly do you think I would help you? David asked, finally looking up. There was something in his gaze that made Victoria hesitate, a profound calmness that only exists in people who have faced absolute devastation and emerged stronger on the other side. Because you're the only lawyer I know who can, she stopped abruptly, suddenly realizing how utterly ridiculous it sounded. David, I know I hurt you deeply, but you've always been a fundamentally good person. You're not like Richard. You have actual principles. David leaned back in his chair, a barely perceptible smile touching his lips. All these years, he had imagined this exact moment. Victoria finally meeting him. Finally realizing she had made the catastrophically wrong choice. But the reality was proving even more satisfying than any fantasy he'd ever constructed. Principles, he repeated slowly, savoring the word. How interesting that this word only seems to matter when you desperately need something. Victoria's phone rang shrilly. She answered it quickly, her voice growing progressively more desperate with each passing second. No, Dad. I haven't been able to. Yes, I understand. 50 million. I know Richard promised he would never. She hung up, her hands trembling visibly. David had watched everything in complete silence, like a predator carefully studying its prey. He knew exactly what was unfolding. He had read extensively about the Richardson case in the morning newspapers. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that David was no longer the naive young lawyer she had so callously abandoned. 50 million? David asked casually. Did your family invest everything in Richard's company? Victoria nodded miserably, tears beginning to form in her carefully made-up eyes. My father put the entire family fortune up as collateral. If we can't prove Richard's innocence, she couldn't finish the sentence. For a brief moment, David almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he remembered the exact words Victoria had said the day she left him. People like you never understand. There's a fundamental difference between dreaming of being someone important in life and actually being someone important. And what exactly do you think I can do? David asked, his voice maintaining that unsettling, perfect calm. You specialize in financial crimes, don't you? Victoria leaned forward desperately. I've heard you've won several supposedly impossible cases in recent years. She paused, swallowing hard. David, I can pay any amount. Anything you want. Name your price. What she couldn't see was the file discreetly open in David's desk drawer, a comprehensive, meticulously detailed dossier on Richard Richardson that he had been systematically compiling for exactly 5 years. It had all started as morbid curiosity about the man who had stolen his wife. But it had evolved into something far more elaborate when David discovered the true, horrifying nature of Richard's business operations. Any amount, David repeated slowly, as if physically savoring each syllable. How fascinating that money always magically appears when you desperately need something. He stood up and walked to the small window overlooking the busy street below. I remember a remarkably similar conversation 10 years ago. Victoria followed his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. David, that was a lifetime ago. We were young and foolish. I made mistakes. Mistakes. David laughed, but there was absolutely no humor in the sound. Is that what you call that night when you made me wait 3 hours at the restaurant while you were actually with him? Victoria's face went pale. She had forgotten, or hoped he'd forgotten, that David had discovered that particular betrayal. The night she'd lied about visiting her sick mother when she was actually at a luxury hotel with Richard, posting photographs on Instagram of $1,000 champagne bottles. Or perhaps you're referring to the mistake of selling our wedding ring to buy that designer party dress, the one you wore when you met your new husband, David continued, his voice maintaining that deeply unsettling calm. Oh no, wait. The biggest mistake was when you told your wealthy friends that I was just a temporary phase you were getting over. That I was practice for the real thing. Victoria closed her eyes tightly. Each word was like a precisely aimed knife striking at wounds she had convinced herself were healed. David, please. Please what? He interrupted. Please forget that you publicly humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. Please pretend I didn't overhear you laughing with Richard about how I actually believed I had a genuine chance with a woman like you. David turned to face her directly, his eyes burning with controlled intensity. Or please ignore the fact that you took our dog, Victoria, and gave him to Richard because street mutts don't belong in penthouses? Tears now streamed freely down Victoria's face, ruining her expensive makeup. The mention of the dog was a devastating low blow. Max had been the only living creature that truly connected them, and she had weaponized even that to hurt him. I was young and incredibly stupid, she whispered. I thought status and money were all that mattered in life. And Richard promised you the world. David gestured toward the Bentley parked conspicuously outside. And he delivered, didn't he? For 10 years, you had everything you ever wanted. A mansion in Beverly Hills, vacations throughout Europe, jewelry that costs more than most people earn in an entire decade. Victoria nodded miserably. But I wasn't happy, David. Not for a single day. That's genuinely unfortunate, David replied with a coldness that made her physically shiver. You know what I did the day after our divorce was finalized? I worked 18 hours straight. The next day, 19 hours. For 6 months, I slept in this very office because I couldn't afford both rent and keeping the business running. He opened a drawer and removed a faded photograph. It showed him visibly thinner, unconscious on top of piles of legal documents in a broken office chair. My partner took this photograph after I literally passed out from exhaustion. I lost 15 pounds in 2 months. I developed a bleeding ulcer from the stress. David placed the photograph on the table directly in front of Victoria. While you were posting pictures of $500 dinners, I had been eating instant noodles for 3 weeks straight. Victoria looked at the photograph and felt genuinely nauseated. In those first intoxicating months after her marriage to Richard, she had truly lived like a princess, never once thinking about what David was enduring. But the funniest part, David continued, was when Richard started secretly investigating my finances. Did you know that? Your new husband hired private investigators to determine if I posed any potential threat to the family business. What are you talking about? Victoria asked, genuinely surprised. David smiled for the first time, but it was the kind of smile that would haunt your nightmares. Did Richard ever tell you that during the first 2 years of your marriage, He was absolutely paranoid that I might use privileged information you had shared with me to damage his business operations. Victoria shook her head slowly, completely confused. He even paid a substantial bribe to a judge to try to get me disbarred from the Bar Association. False allegations of grossly unethical conduct. I spent 8 months fighting desperately to keep my license while you two were honeymooning in the Caribbean. The revelation hit Victoria like a physical slap. Richard had never mentioned anything about it, not once in 10 years. All this time, she had assumed David had simply moved on with his life, perhaps even relieved to be rid of her. Richard tried to systematically destroy me professionally, David continued, his voice taking on a dangerous intensity. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that every attack only made me more determined. Every attempt to hurt me taught me something invaluable about how the system really works. Victoria's phone rang again. This time, she ignored it completely. "Aren't you going to answer?" David asked with feigned concern. "I'm betting it's your father, desperately asking if you found a magic solution for the $50 million Richard lost in his fraudulent schemes." Victoria looked at him with sudden, dawning understanding. "How do you know the specific details about Richard's arrest?" "The newspapers only mentioned general tax fraud." David sat back down, folding his fingers carefully on the table. "Because, my dear ex-wife, I know exactly what kind of fraud Richard committed. I know the name of every single shell company he created. I know about every offshore account, every forged document, every bribed official." "That's impossible," Victoria whispered. "It's impossible for the failed lawyer you abandoned 10 years ago," David agreed calmly. "But it's not impossible for the man he's become." Victoria looked around the simple office, desperately trying to reconcile the modesty of the surroundings with the absolute confidence David was displaying. Something didn't fit. Something crucial she was missing. "David, I don't understand." "Of course you don't," he interrupted smoothly. "Because you still see me as that naive young man who cried when you left him. You still think you're dealing with someone desperate for your approval." At that precise moment, the office door opened and an elegant African-American woman entered, wearing an impeccable designer suit that cost considerably more than Victoria's car. "David, sorry to interrupt," she said professionally, "but Senator Martinez called. He wants to confirm that you'll be attending tomorrow's meeting on federal judicial reform." Victoria watched the interaction, completely confused. "What senator? What judicial reform?" "Of course, Patricia," David replied. "Please confirm that I'll definitely be there." He turned to Victoria. "Patricia, this is Victoria Richardson." "Victoria, Patricia is my partner in the firm." "Firm?" Victoria thought with growing confusion. She had assumed David worked alone in this small office. Patricia extended her hand politely. "Pleased to meet you, Ms. Richardson. I must say it's deeply ironic to finally meet you here, considering the extensive work we've done over the past few years." "What work?" Victoria asked, shaking the woman's hand mechanically. Patricia looked at David, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Well," Patricia said with a professional smile, "our firm specializes specifically in cases against corporations that commit large-scale tax fraud. Richardson Industries has been one of our primary targets of investigation for quite some time." Victoria's entire world stopped. "What do you mean, target of investigation?" "What Patricia is trying to say politely," David explained with perfect calm, "is that I've spent the last 5 years systematically building the case against your husband. Every document the FBI discovered yesterday, I provided it. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every financial record." Victoria stood up so abruptly that her chair fell backward with a crash. You had Richard arrested." "I had justice served," David corrected. "Richard is guilty of every single crime he was arrested for. I just made absolutely certain the authorities had all the necessary evidence." The realization hit Victoria with devastating force. She hadn't sought out David by random chance. She hadn't thought of him as a last resort out of pure desperation. David had orchestrated everything, every single detail, so that she would end up exactly where she was now, begging for help from the man she had destroyed, who was now systematically destroying her life in return. "My God," she whispered. "You planned all of this." What Victoria didn't yet know was that Richard's arrest was merely the opening move in a far more complex game, and that the quiet, unassuming man she had so catastrophically underestimated for so long was about to show her that 10 years of humiliation could transform a broken heart into the most dangerous strategist she could ever imagine facing. 5 years, David repeated, walking over to a framed photograph on the wall, an official award ceremony. Victoria looked closer and felt her stomach sink with dread. It was the Federal Department of Justice's Award for Excellence in Criminal Law. 5 years since I decided Richard Richardson needed to pay for every single life he destroyed with his schemes. David turned the frame around, revealing a second award mounted behind it. 3 years since I became a special advisor to the FBI for corporate financial crimes. Patricia opened a thick folder and spread documents systematically across the table. Victoria, your husband didn't just commit tax fraud. He embezzled retirement funds from 847 employees. He falsified environmental reports that caused toxic contamination in 2 entire cities. And he bribed federal officials to cover up multiple deaths at his factories. Victoria stared at the documents as if they were poisonous snakes. That can't be true. Richard said the company's problems were just bureaucratic issues that would blow over. Richard said a lot of things, David interrupted coldly. Like when he told his investors that you had finally upgraded your life by marrying him. Or when he toasted at your wedding, saying he had saved a woman from wasting her life with inferior people. Victoria's face crumbled. She didn't know David had overheard that conversation. Or perhaps you prefer the version where he told potential investors that your previous divorce was just a youthful mistake with a third-rate lawyer? David smiled without warmth. I have it all recorded, of course. At that moment, Victoria's phone rang loudly. It was Richard calling from prison. She looked at David silently, asking for permission to answer. He nodded magnanimously. Richard, where are you? What's happening? Victoria spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear clearly. Victoria, listen very carefully. Richard's arrogant voice echoed through the speaker that David had discreetly activated. This whole thing is temporary. My lawyers will straighten it out in a few hours. You didn't say anything compromising to anyone, did you? Richard, I'm with, Victoria began, but he interrupted her immediately. I don't care who you're with. Just don't do anything stupid. And Victoria, maybe it's time to sell some of that jewelry and withdraw money from your personal account. I need $200,000 for bail. David signaled for Victoria to continue the conversation. Richard, I need to tell you something. I'm at David's office, my ex-husband. The silence on the other end of the line was absolutely deafening. Then Richard burst out laughing, loud, mocking, cruel laughter. That loser? Victoria, have you completely lost your mind? What can that nobody possibly do for us? He can barely pay his own rent. Richard laughed even harder. Let me guess, he offered to help for free because he's still pathetically in love with you? David approached the phone calmly. Hello, Richard. It's been quite a while since we last spoke face to face. Richard's tone changed instantly, becoming suspicious and hostile. David, what are you doing there? Talking to my ex-wife about how I might help her through this difficult time, David replied with perfect calm. Look here, you little lawyer, Richard said, his arrogance flooding back. I don't know what pathetic little game you're trying to play, but this is way too big for you. We're talking about Richardson Industries, not your insignificant neighborhood cases. Little neighborhood cases? David repeated, looking at Patricia with genuine amusement. Interesting characterization. Patricia, can you show Victoria the file on the little cases we've won recently? Patricia opened another comprehensive file. Petromax Corporation lawsuit, $340 million in damages awarded. Williams versus Southern Chemical Industries, $180 million in class action settlement. Federal prosecution against. Enough, Victoria whispered, interrupting the list. Please, enough. On the other end of the line, Richard had fallen completely silent. Finally, he spoke, his voice laden with growing suspicion and dawning fear. David, what exactly do you want? Justice, David replied simply. Something you've stolen from many people over the years, including my ex-wife. What do you mean stolen from her? Richard demanded. David looked directly at Victoria, his expression unreadable. You never told him about the baby, did you, Victoria? The world stopped. Victoria turned completely pale. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. Patricia looked surprised, glancing between them. What baby? Richard shouted into the phone. Victoria, what baby? Victoria opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat had completely closed. David continued relentlessly, his voice clinical. The baby Victoria was expecting when she left me to marry you, Richard. The baby she lost 3 weeks after the wedding due to the extreme stress and pressure you put on her to be the perfect trophy wife. That's a lie, Richard stammered. But his voice had lost all its authority. Victoria spent 2 weeks in the hospital while you were on a business trip in Europe, David continued. She tried to tell you when you returned, but you said, and I quote, I don't want domestic drama getting in the way of the company's expansion. David approached Victoria, who was now crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Victoria never forgave herself for choosing social status over a real family. And you, Richard, never knew that you destroyed her only chance to be a mother. The doctors said the trauma made future pregnancies impossible. The silence on the phone line was absolute and suffocating. Finally, Richard's voice emerged as barely a whisper. Victoria, is this true? Victoria could barely nod, even though she knew he couldn't see her. That's why, David continued, when I decided to finish you off, it wasn't just personal revenge. It was justice for every person you destroyed over the years, including the woman I loved, whom you systematically turned into a shadow of her former self. David walked over to a drawer and removed another file, this one thicker than all the previous ones combined. Richard, do you remember Marcus Williams? The black engineer who tried to report critical safety issues at your chemical plant 3 years ago. How do you? Marcus was fired, professionally defamed, and his entire family received death threats until they fled the city. David continued relentlessly. What you didn't know was that Marcus was Patricia's cousin. When he came to me for a labor lawsuit, we started investigating you much, much more deeply. Patricia picked up a photograph from the table. Marcus died last year, Richard. Aggressive cancer caused by exposure to the toxic chemicals that you knew were dangerous and deliberately decided to hide to protect your profit margins. You can't prove. We can prove everything, David interrupted him. 3 years of comprehensive investigation, Richard. 3 years collecting evidence, testimony, documents. We have audio recordings of you personally approving illegal toxic dumping. We have emails where you explicitly order medical reports to be falsified and hidden. We have bank records of every single bribe you paid. Victoria raised her head, looking at David with a mixture of absolute terror and reluctant admiration. You planned all this, she said. Every single move. David confirmed with a slight nod. Every step Richard has taken in the last 3 years has been anticipated and meticulously documented. Even this conversation is being recorded and broadcast live to federal investigators. A sound of pure panic came from the phone. Richard had obviously dropped the device in shock. When he picked it up again, his voice was completely different. All arrogance stripped away, replaced by desperate fear. David, listen. We can talk. We can make a deal. Name your price. The only deal, David said with perfect calm, is for you to take full responsibility for all the crimes you've committed and accept a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Never. Then I'll see you in court, Richard. David paused deliberately. Oh, and Richard, one last thing. What? David smiled for the first time with genuine joy. Remember that young lawyer with no future that Victoria left 10 years ago? He's become the man who will systematically destroy your entire empire and prove that true greatness has never had anything to do with a silver spoon or an important surname. The call ended abruptly. Victoria looked at David as if she were seeing a complete stranger. My God, she whispered. Who have you become? David calmly began putting the documents away. I've become exactly the person you said I would never be, Victoria. I've become someone Richardson Industries would fear to face. But while Victoria struggled to process the magnitude of the transformation in the man she had so catastrophically underestimated for so long, she had no idea that David's true revenge was just beginning. In the coming days, she would discover that losing $50 million would be the least of her problems compared to what David had really planned, not only to destroy Richard, but to dismantle the entire corrupt system that had allowed men like him to thrive by systematically trampling on people like the idealistic young lawyer she had abandoned. "David," Victoria whispered, still desperately trying to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. "You really did all this for revenge?" "Not for revenge," David corrected, walking over to a television screen mounted on the wall. "For justice. There's a fundamental difference." He turned on the television, tuning to a major news channel. The screen showed multiple helicopters flying over Richard's sprawling mansion while federal agents in windbreakers carried box after box of evidence. "Live broadcast," Patricia explained clinically. "The search and seizure warrant was executed 20 minutes ago. It's being broadcast in real time to every news station in the country." Victoria watched, mesmerized, as the news anchor narrated breathlessly. "A coordinated federal operation that has exposed a corruption scheme involving at least 15 public officials, resulting in the largest seizure of assets for financial crimes in the state's history." David's phone rang. He answered it calmly, deliberately putting it on speakerphone. "David. David, you have to get me out of here." It was Richard, clearly in a state of absolute panic. "They're taking everything. My house, my cars, my art collection, even Victoria's jewelry." "Calm down, Richard," David replied with feigned concern. "Tell me exactly what's happening." "They have recordings," Richard shouted, his voice echoing through what sounded like a prison cell. "Recordings of conversations I had years ago. How is that even possible?" David looked directly at Victoria. "Remember the office renovation you did in Richard's study 3 years ago? When he complained constantly that the work was taking longer than expected?" Victoria nodded slowly, a terrible realization dawning in her eyes. "Patricia coordinated that renovation," David continued. "Our people installed sophisticated audio devices in strategic locations throughout the office. 3 years of recording every criminal conversation, every planned bribe, every threat made." "My God," Victoria murmured. On the phone, Richard continued desperately. "Victoria. Victoria, are you there? I need you to come visit me immediately. I need to explain some things to you before it's too late." "What kind of things?" David asked innocently. "Not with you listening." Richard exploded. "Victoria, there are accounts you don't know about. Accounts with money that doesn't appear in any official documents. If you don't withdraw that money today, the feds will find everything." Victoria turned completely pale. "Richard, what accounts? What money are you talking about?" "The 15 million in the Cayman Islands. The 8 million in Panama. Victoria, that money is in your name. If the feds find it, you'll be arrested as an accomplice." The silence that followed was absolutely suffocating. Victoria looked at David with an expression of pure, undiluted terror. "You didn't know about the money, did you?" David asked softly. Victoria shook her head, unable to speak. "Richard used your personal information to open offshore accounts," Patricia explained clinically. "Standard technique for sophisticated money laundering. If he got caught, you would take the blame too. You were his insurance policy." From the phone came a groan of absolute despair from Richard. "Victoria, you have to understand. It was to protect us. It was a safety plan." "Safety." Victoria finally found her voice. "You put $23 million of dirty money in my name without my knowledge. It was temporary. I was going to transfer it all back once the investigations were over." David approached the phone. "Richard, how long have you been planning this safety net?" "That's none of your damn business." "Actually, it is." David opened another file. "Because we discovered that you started transferring money to accounts in Victoria's name 3 days after your wedding. 10 years of using your own wife as an unwitting front for money laundering." Victoria stood up abruptly and began pacing frantically. 10 years. For 10 entire years, I was your unknowing accomplice." "Victoria, listen." Richard tried one last desperate time. Listen to what? She shouted. More lies. You need to leave the country today. Take the money from the accounts and go somewhere without an extradition treaty. And abandon my father? Victoria asked incredulously. My family? Your family has already lost everything. Richard screamed. Your father's $50 million was used as collateral for operations that I knew were illegal. There is nothing left to save. The entire confession had been recorded. Patricia made a discreet gesture, and David nodded almost imperceptibly. Richard, David said calmly, you just confessed on a recorded call that you knowingly used Victoria's family's money for illegal operations, knowing that they would lose everything. The silence on the other end of the line lasted for several long, agonizing seconds. When Richard spoke again, his voice was completely different, all bravado gone. You recorded this conversation. I did. And you're going to use it against me. I already have. The recording was automatically sent to the FBI, federal prosecutors, and 3 different television stations approximately 30 seconds ago. Victoria sat down heavily, covering her face with her hands. David, Richard said, his voice now a defeated whisper.
Why?
Why all this? David approached Victoria, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. Because, Richard, you didn't just destroy my life when you stole Victoria. You destroyed the lives of hundreds of people. Employees who lost their entire pensions. Families who lost their homes. Entire communities poisoned by your industrial chemicals. He paused, looking at Victoria with a tenderness she hadn't seen in years. And because Victoria deserved to know the truth about the man she was married to, she deserved the chance to choose a different life before it was too late. From the phone came the sound of Richard crying, deep, broken sobs from a man who finally understood that he had lost absolutely everything. My company, he murmured. My reputation. My fortune. Your freedom, David added. Don't forget your freedom. Based on the evidence we've gathered, you're looking at 25 to 30 years in federal prison. Victoria raised her head, looking at David with a mixture of admiration and terror. What about me? What happens to me now? David smiled for the first time with genuine kindness. Patricia has already prepared your complete defense. You are a victim, not an accomplice. We will prove that Richard forged your signature and used your personal data without your knowledge or consent. But my father, the $50 million,